Well, this is additions to Daniel, and it is a part of the writings, the Ketuvim, and it really isn't held the whole. So the situation? I know Denny read. I don't know how much the rest of y'all read, but I looked at it. But it's worth looking at. I really like some of these are more worthwhile than others. I don't just my overview of this is I don't have I wouldn't have a problem if this were there. I actually really liked the Bell and the Dragon one. The Susanna section was kind of weird for me and interesting, but it's, kind of, again, kind of in the same vein as some other darker passages in Scripture. Speaking of which, just as an aside, the denominational offices, national offices, under fire because they used the passage in, I don't know what the reference was off the top of my head, but it was the story of when the townsmen came to the old man's house and asked to basically rape the man who was their guest. And he said, no, here, have my daughter and his concubine. And they basically raped them and then returned them in the morning. And it's this horrible, horrible text. And this was assigned as the exegesis passage for future ministers. So there's some challenges there, and I think there's some rational reasons why they might have chose that. But at the same time, I think that it's triggered a lot of traumatic stuff for people, and I think this falls into the same category. This has got a level of personal violence that probably at the time that it was written or the era that it was read in didn't seem as barbaric as it does today. I'll say that because it was a very different time. In other words, I think that the abuse of women and the women as property was something that was a part of ancient Near East. So this wouldn't have been as offensive back then as it is to us today because we have a different view of male-female relationships and patriarchy and how that sort of affected things. But it is there, and we'll look at it briefly at the story of that. But these are three editions that essentially were not a part of the original Daniel. And I want to do an overview of Daniel, and then I want to look at where these fit in. But Daniel really wasn't even, if you go back, if you remember, Daniel was not like written in it's set. Daniel is sort of set in a time around when the Exodus towards the first attack on Jerusalem happened. So what were the dates that I wrote down? When they first went into exile, I guess it would have been 578 or something around that, or 587 around that. So after the first attack on Jerusalem, and you got to imagine again, from the time of King David, just as sort of brief history, the time of King David established, I always put that around 1000. It wasn't actually then, but the Davidic king there. And then you have succession of Solomon, and then you have Solomon's two sons, Rehoboam and Jeroboam, and they split the kingdom in half. Israel in the north and Judah in the south. And then from there, it just goes to, for many, many years, about 200 years of bad and mostly bad kings. In the north, they were almost all bad. In the south, they were 2/3 bad, maybe. But this is sort of set around that time. And when the Babylonians finally attacked Judah, this is sort of set in that era. And this is right before that Exodus, where those Israelites then are sent over into the area of Babylon, which eventually was overtaken by the Persians. And so it's thought that this is set during that time because Daniel as a whole, as a book, is sort of a reflection on the departure of Israel or that exiled time of what was happening. Daniel is the only apocalyptic book in the Old Testament. And it's mentioned in the New Testament and the apocalyptic literature there. And the challenge of it is there are stories and narratives in this that are sometimes could be perceived as being literal or sometimes perceived as being symbolic. As you probably remember from Daniel, the major stories were Daniel's friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, his interactions with the king, and the Daniel in the lion's den. And then there are 4 visions that are offered. And in all of these things, this is sort of meant to sort of have an end time feel. But for those Jews who went through this entire dynasty, even though they had these bad kings, they were still a nation. They were still a nation that had power or influence or a place in the narrative. So to all of a sudden, pretty much over a period of, 150 years, have the Assyrians in the north and the Babylonians in the south basically to overtake those lands. In the north, they just went in diaspora and spread and had many exiles. But then you have a massive exodus from Jerusalem around the time of 587, around that time. The thought is that there are parts of Daniel as a whole, the version we have, that were organized during the Second Temple period, which was 537. So 70 is so some sort of in that period where they were sent back to 70 AD, which is the destruction of the second, or 70 AD, which is the destruction of the Second Temple. It's thought that it was likely written around the 3rd century, which is interesting because the editions, which are only found in Greek, are probably thought to be written maybe 100 or so years later. So the original Semitic version, which was we have versions both in Hebrew and in Aramaic, are the versions that we get our Daniel from. But then, 150 years later, you have these additions too that sort of fill out the story a little bit. So it's not that like large period, like the Wisdom of Solomon, where you have, probably 500 to 600, 700 years between where they're inserting it, and they're trying to suggest that it was written during that time. These are things that clearly were added. And I would say the largest reason that we don't, again, accept this as a part of Daniel is largely just because it was the only versions of these little vignettes that we have today were written in Greek, and we have no Aramaic or Hebrew versions. So when you're looking at it, you're like, we have these texts here, and then we have these extra ones that are only written in Greek. How do we really fit them in across the board? This has been sort of a standard for these books. Glenda, you're shaking your head. Is that?
I don't understand why they would have been written from a whole different tradition. Why would they have? Where would this stuff have originated?
Well, the story itself would have originated within the Hebrew community in the 3rd century, and it would have been written in the language at the time, Hebrew and Aramaic. And then as Hellenization happened and Jews, and this is the whole, next week we'll look at this, and part of this is what Maccabees is about, the rebellion against, the Greek influence. It gives rise to many of these assertions and many of these things. So the question that runs through the back of my head always is, why were they inserting this? So when we look at, Bel and the Dragon, or Bel the Dragon, or the Songs of Ezra, Azariah and the Songs of the Three Jews, like that gives more detail. So at some point, and what had happened is that the Hebrew and Aramaic version, or some version of those, would have been translated into Greek for these new audiences, and these new generations of Jews who were now speaking Greek instead of Aramaic or Hebrew. Not that they still couldn't read. It's kind of like Catholics in Latin. They don't really read Latin, but they kind of know enough to squirrel their way around it. But it's not like their first language. So you had, at some point in the 1st century before Christ, you had Jews who were speaking and reading in Greek, but they still had knowledge of Hebrew. It was the sacred scriptures were in Hebrew, or stored in Hebrew or in Aramaic.
So does it go back to a Hebrew text that they're drawing this from, that they translated, or is it oral tradition that they got this information from?
No, we don't know, and that's the challenge. We know. So what we have is we have these old versions of Greek or of Hebrew and Aramaic, and they're consistent with what we have in our Protestant Bible. A couple centuries or a century and a half later, they add these additions to them, and we don't know when that was or why they did it, other than Jewish identity and that sort of thing. But by then, they weren't like taking the Hebrew stuff and like, let's insert some Greek stuff. That Hebrew and Aramaic stuff was translated into Greek. So that those 1st century BC Jews would have said, well, we have this book here, and who knows? They might have said, the oral tradition might have filled those things out. Like I said in the Azariah prayer, I mean, it adds more context, it adds more story, it like gives you something. And so maybe they got, and it's like split right in the middle, and it's true. And we'll look at that. If that's split right in the middle, you think, well, it does kind of go abruptly from them in the furnace to the king praising. It just feels like it just switches between verse 23 and 24. So when you consider like the addition that it brings to it, and not that it's not a bad addition or a contradictory one, it's just the fact that that addition was only found in Greek. And if it's only found in Greek, the assumption it was written during that period of early Hellenization.
What character is Azariah compared to the Hebrew? I mean, that was Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Which character is
Azariah was, who was he? I forget. Where did I write down? Well, we'll deal with them in order. How about that? That might be helpful. I can only order so much in my brain today. What else about the original? I think that was it. Oh, I thought it was the structure of it in general in Daniel is you have the stories chapters 1 through 6 are the stories of what happened in terms of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and then in 7 through and the lion's den, and then 7 through 12 are these apocalyptic visions. And this is sort of the apocalyptic part. You have the narrative part, which sort of forms its own part that feels like it's just a story about a character during the exile in a foreign land, and then you have this part that are kind of trippy and weird, like Revelation. And again, I don't know. I've always loved the story of Daniel and the lion's den, and I remember reading books and about those. I never really understood where they fit in the history of Israel. But when you see where they fit in the history of Israel, and you start to say, why were these written? What is the point? And the larger overarching point that Daniel offers us is that God, that Israel, if you're obedient to God, this is no surprise. Like this has been all the time we've studied every book. If you're obedient to God, God will rescue you. If you're disobedient to God, God won't. God's the one true God sort of thing. So we see that repeated throughout. We see that emphasis in particular in times of Elijah and some of the other prophets where they're emphasizing God's power over that of the foreign nations. What in particular, just Daniel as a whole, and what comes out in many of sort of as a theme of all of these editions is the futility of false gods.
Yeah.
And the Greeks brought a whole slew of them. So they were like, hey, these are statues, we'll worship them. And it adds to that story. So that's why I like the Bell and the Dragon. We'll get to that though. There's there's some trickery about whether Bell was real or not, and it's sort of like hey, this is like detective work. It's like the earliest Encyclopedia Brown. Oh, how'd they know that the Bell didn't eat those things? Well, they're footprints that look like kids' footprints. This is the priests were eating the food with their families. Through a secret door. Anytime you have a secret door, and there's part of me that's like, why don't include this? Like, if I was a kid and I was like, what? They've tricked them and solved this mystery by putting ash on the floor. Like, what kid wouldn't love that? But so, and there's a lot of things actually that fall into that category. But if you want to do the structure or the sequence of the whole thing, what you would do is you would put Susanna. This is the sultry story of her accusation of improprieties and almost rape, and with the wicked elders, and that is actually considered a precursor. And there are two versions of that, and we'll look at those here in a moment. But that's meant to be almost before any of the Daniel started. So if you were to read it in context, this is the story that sets up. It would be the beginning of what would have ended up in the Daniel. Then you have Daniel 1:1 through Daniel 3:23. And then you have the prayer of Azariah and the song of three Jews. And this is just a fuller story. It fills out some of the details. It takes what is a somewhat abrupt transition and fills it in. And what's interesting in the commentaries that I remember reading was that many scholars agree that there is an abrupt transition from 3:23 to 3:24. And they think that there's something maybe that's missing, but they sort of, these Protestant theologians genuinely agree that these aren't the things that were missing, but they are nice nonetheless. Then you have Daniel, picks it up, and it goes from Daniel 24, right there, Daniel, I should say 3:24, not 3. Daniel 3:24 through Daniel 12:13. And so that you take the rest of Daniel, and that's where you'll have the rest of the story of Daniel in the den, And then you have, starting with chapter 7, the vision that Daniel has. And then finally, it ends with this bell and the dragon. And some have this as an appendix to Psalms, but this is left here. And again, I think that not just because it says dragon, but I think the whole, just the story. I thought that was my favorite part. Maybe my favorite Apocrypha book. Just that story of. So we'll get to that and look at that. But that forms then the rest of chapter 13 for Daniel. So basically, it's the beginning, the end, and the middle. And so we'll address them, although they're not listed that way. In my Bible, for whatever reason, the prayer of Azariah is listed first. But I think we'll address them in the order that they come. Generally speaking, the impact of these three editions offer it serves as a magnifier of the miraculous events that exist around Daniel's life experience and experience with the king. It adds more detail. It fills in some narrative around that is anything lost? Not really in the end, but it's nice to have. I mean, it's one of those things. It's kind of like early or late version. I don't know. I mean, it's editor's choice. All three parts have a strong opposition to corruption in leaders and the corrupt nature of leaders. So in the first, the elders that are trying to attempt to rape Susanna. The second of the not the king necessarily, but the people, the advisors who the king's listening to, in their corruption, and finally those priests who were corrupt and were basically putting on a facade that Bel the dragon was eating the given food, but wasn't. And so they're all dealing with the opposition of corrupt leaders. All three have a certain ridiculing of idols and the idea of idolatry. And again, this is during that 400 years of silence where Israelites were like, what the heck? Well, you've reestablished us and now we're just sort of floating out here. And so you had the influences not only of the Persians, because they were the rulers of the time, but you also have that increasing Greek influence as the Greeks spread west. And so you have, and both of whom had false gods that they worshipped. So the big concern in that period for the Jews of that time would have been, we need to keep our folks focused on this radical monotheism of worshiping Yahweh and understanding that this is foolishness that's coming from other nations. And I would say the last would be praising God's creative power and faithfulness in the history of Israel, just the remaining with. Are any of these stories true? We don't know. I don't know if it really matters. I mean, like many things in life, I mean, if you look back at the history of just Greek literature or in general, most of the stories were meant to help people understand what it meant to be virtuous, to have a hero. And for Jews of the first century BC, this would have been significant at a time where their identities are being threatened. You have a strong emphasis on Daniel as this ideal hero type archetype figure who wouldn't eat the food offered only if it stood his ground, and God sent an angel to protect his friends, and God closed the mouths of the lions and ministered to Daniel in that way. So again, just at the end, the overarching picture is as God protects those who are faithful and helps those who are faithful. And if you're in a time of massive transition in terms of your cultural identity, this is a reminder your God is more powerful. And again, I think a lot of this will make more historical sense when we look at the Maccabees and what the Maccabean revolt was about. Because that's just an interesting time of really saying, hey, we need to focus on this. Okay. That's the introduction. Is anyone, any questions around that? I'm just going to snort it up right now. If it gets bad, I'll take a break. I didn't record my sermon on Sunday, but I had a lot of people tell me that I looked and they experienced my sermon more roughly than I thought I looked. Let's start with
that was good because you powered through it. So
well, I was when I discovered that the idea of I never really felt comfortable with the whole we're the light and salt, and I was like, what does that mean to be salt? And people were like, we're the flavor of the earth. And I got so sick of seeing crappy, quite frankly, crappy sermons written around, we're meant to be the flavor. We're meant to, so then what are we, flavor text for the world? Like that just didn't, I never set well with me. And so when I discovered that idea that tastelessness is really tasteless, and this connection to the moroni and that sense of not a, we're not flavoring, but we are the wisdom and the righteousness of God. And so it just opened up the whole text to me. And I was like, I have to preach on this. I can't, so I powered through. I don't know, it was my best sermon in the world, but I gave it nonetheless. So Susanna, let's go there. Do any of you have the text with you? So if I reference, I don't want to like reference things that you know.
I do.
All right, well, I may read some of this as we go, but let me kind of give you an overview of Susanna. It is not super long. It is only 64 verses. And again, this would have come at the beginning. And so imagine now that this was an addition. So those in the first century who are reading the book of Daniel would have had this as part of it. And Daniel's kind of a, smushed together book anyways, but it just, sort of starts abruptly. Another reason you might think this is not really a part of the original, but it starts with, there's a man living in Babylon whose name was Joachim. He married the daughter of Hilkiah, who named Susanna, a very beautiful woman, and the one who'd feared the Lord. Her parents were righteous and had trained the daughter according to the laws of Moses. Joachim was very rich and had a fine garden adjoining his house, and the Jews used to come to him because he was the most honored of all of them. So you have this context where they're just setting the stage of like this is an ideal Jewish family. They have this great daughter who's been trained in the ways of God, and then it gets pretty darkness here. That year, 2 elders from the people were appointed as judges amongst those obviously in exile. Concerning them, the Lord had said, wickedness came forth from Babylon, from the elders who were judges, who were supposed to govern the people. These men frequently at Joachim's house, and who all had a case to be tried, came to them there. And then I guess without actually reading the whole thing, and I do think it's worth reading it, but Susanna would then go into her husband's garden for a walk. And every day the elders would see her going there, and they began to lust for her. They just name it. And as the story goes, they basically they make up a lot. They are planning to attack her and have sex with her, and they accuse her, though, ultimately of being impropriety, having impropriety with another young man, and they make up this lie. And so basically you have the opening scene, verses 1-4. You have a sort of a portrayal of what I just read of the wicked elders, and then you have this attempted seduction where it goes into this this narrative of trying to twist the story, and really gets good in the sense of 28-43, where the trial. And they basically both present their case, and they sound very similar. They're accusing her of impropriety with a young man, but one describes this tree they were by as being, I don't remember the actual type of plant. Do you, Denny, what the plant was? It was a bush. It was more of a bush that would have grown maybe 5 to 6 feet in size, and the other described it as an oak tree. And so beyond this, on the incongruity of their testimony, one being an oak, one being this bush, they toss it out, and then her reputation is redeemed. And then the 44-64 is Daniel's intervention, and Daniel is sort of brought into the picture of the story through the idea that he's a hero that helped save her. There are 2 texts that surround Susanna. One, and we'll refer to this as we look at some of the other editions too. There's a Theodotian text, which would have originally drawn its sources from just only the Hebrew and the Aramaic, and that's the version we have in the NRSV that I'm looking at. But there's also what's called an Old Greek version that they do think is actually earlier than the Theodotian text, but it's missing that first section of 1-5 where they introduce the sort of historical information that sort of sets it in a time and place. They also, these 2 versions have different endings. Strangely enough, the Old Greek ends with young people being the subject, where they admonish the community that they should seek out youth that sort of have these virtues of Daniel. And it's sort of an interesting, as one in youth ministry, it's an interesting text in terms of saying, what does it mean to be a young person of God? But the Theodosian text is what we have is a sort of exalting of Susanna, of Daniel, but through testimony of Susanna's father and mother, husband, and praises Susanna herself. And so Daniel sort of is sort of the whole. It's sort of a praise of all these people and an acknowledgement that Daniel is the hero at the end of the story. I don't know if I want to say much more than that, because I don't think it's, again, just in terms of, I don't really know if it adds much in terms of the story itself. It sort of stands on a story by itself, but it gives a place for Daniel to enter. And then we pick up with Daniel. And I should actually, let me read the end of, I should have marked in my Bible so I can find it. But too far, so we get back to those smaller books. Daniel as a book then picks up the story where we're accustomed to, but what I want to do is read the end. So if you're reading it as one whole book, you'd get the feeling of how it read. Give me 1 second here. Chapter 4. Here we go. So if we went from the end of Susanna, I'll read you the last. The whole assembly raised a great shout and blessed God, those who save, whose hope is in him. And they took action against the two elders because of their own mouths. Daniel had convicted them of bearing false witness. They did to them as they had wickedly planned to do to their neighbors, acting in accordance with the law of Moses. They put them to death. Thus innocent blood was spared that day. Aquila and his wife praised God for their daughter Susanna, and so did their husband Joachim and their relatives, because she was found innocent of a shameful deed. And from that day onward, Daniel had a great reputation among the people. So it's kind of like Daniel's, and they're introducing one of the reasons they put this in the beginning is because if you read that, it's like it was almost assumes Daniel is not a character that has been introduced, and this is sort of, this is the background story of, I love origin stories for superheroes and things like that. Those are actually more, I think I get tired of that they beat up the current guy who's attacking the city. That's just a boring narrative to me. But how that becoming, I know Denny's smiling in this both in person and I do like X-Men stories of how they come into that role. This is sort of Daniel's, like, you're like, well, how did Daniel get to be like a person that actually made a difference? Well, this is how he was involved in this great trial and this great rescue of an innocent woman who was accused of impropriety. But we go from great reputation among the people, and then it would start in then the third year of the reign of King Jehoiakim of Judah, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And then it starts with the story that we know in Daniel. So if you're reading along, it doesn't necessarily, have a sharp break, but it is sort of like an unnecessary one. It could have functioned as a prologue or a story that sort of just happens in time before the actual third year of the reign of King Jehoiakim. So I'll stop there. Any questions about Susanna and the elders?
Kind of a stereotype.
What do you mean?
Oh, it's always a woman's beauty that gets her in trouble.
Yeah. Why do you think Adam ate that apple?
I don't know. Was she beautiful?
No, I would. Well, I mean, she was the perfect 10 because there's no one else to compare her to. No, I think. No, but you're right. All of these, actually, I mean, not only in Esther, and we saw that I'm dropping, who was it? We just looked at in the Apocrypha. They had other editions too. No, who was it that we looked at the same story of Esther, of having great beauty, who killed I don't know, my mouth. whoever we looked at earlier, who killed the king by cutting off his head. Who was that? I can't remember the name of the.
Yeah.
You know what I'm talking about, though.
Yeah.
That text. You look at Ruth. You look at, these are all, they were all women. Look at Bathsheba. She was. So, but at the time, you have to really consider, and this is the challenge we have in our modern day context, is we want to interpret all of these things with our present day understanding of relationships between men and women. And not that that's an unfair way to look at it, but if you have to consider what the role of women were in the time, beauty was one. I mean, anyone could wash your clothes or do the work around, keep a house or care for the children. That was just sort of the default. The things that distinguished women and usually set them apart were their beauty. And I would say the equivalent of, at the time, when you think about just even the evolution of humanity, might makes right. The bigger gorilla is going to win. The stronger gorilla is going to win. The bigger bull, the bigger lion, the bigger might makes right. Men have always operated on the construct, for many, for thousands of years of human existence and animal existence. Power meant right. Power meant control. Power meant strength, size. And this is what made King David such a role reversal, is that he was this little puny guy, and no one would have expected that of him. And so for women, though, it wasn't about how strong they were. That was a masculine trait. For women, it was the feminine trait of beauty. And so those who were considered beautiful had strength in that, in that seductive power. And honestly, there are I have some great books about it. If you want to look into the history of it. The history of women's sexuality and power and how we have understood them throughout the history of time is really fascinating, because so many things have changed and shifted in history because of that perception in the way women have yielded that sexual power. So this, in the same way, is a demonstration of, just because she was beautiful, it didn't help her in this situation, but she was faithful regardless of what she looked like. And it brought, because otherwise, what would be it just sort of boils down to some guys trying to rape some woman who they saw taking a bath. Well, again, that's us projecting our idea of nudity. Back then, nudity was very common. It was far more common, but the spying or the voyeurism that this sort of portrays, and the acknowledgement that they were lust of the elders, they were, the story is built around the idea of their perception of her as a woman rather than, but that would have been, again, not uncommon at the time. Women would still have been largely looked at as property back then. All right, thoughts? Nope. All right, we're going to move on. Let's go to the prayer of Azariah. Where is that? This is the longest of the three. This is the one that, I think it's 68, not by much, but by 68. And in short, if you look at go back to where actual Daniel was. If you look at Daniel, if you have your Bibles, you can look at Daniel 23 if you want. And Daniel 3:23. Let me just read you what leads up to it, and we'll stop, and then we'll carry on with Azariah. So 3:19. That's where the break is. The Nebuchadnezzar was so filled with rage against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego that his face was distorted. He ordered the furnace to be heated up several times more than it was customary, and then ordered some of the strongest guards of his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and to throw them into the furnace of blazing fire. So the men were bound and still wearing their tunics and their trousers. Thank goodness, because no one wants paintless man burning. Their hats and their other garments, and they were thrown into the furnace of blazing fire. Because the king's command was urgent and the furnace was so overheated, the raging flames killed the men who lifted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But the three men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell down bound into the furnace of blazing fire. So this is where the break point is. And I'll just so as a reference point, and you can hear the cut. And then 24, it says, then the king Nebuchadnezzar was astonished and rose up quickly and said to his counselors, was it not three men who were bound in the fire? And they answered the king, oh, true. So this is before, this is like, there's no hey, there's a fourth person there. We learn about that in the king's reaction. They're thrown in, and then we get the reflection of what happened, or the reaction of what happened to the king. But if we ended with in verse 23, but the three men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell down bound into the furnace of blazing fire, and then we turn over to the prayer of Azariah, and it says, just picks up with the story as if it carried on. They walked around the midst of the flames, singing hymns to God and blessing the Lord. And then Azariah stood still in the fire and prayed aloud. And then we'll go down to the section of what it was. That was you?
Was a little confused.
Are you still confused?
No, I'm good.
Okay.
Yeah, he didn't realize that this story is basically told in Daniel. What happened here is also told in Daniel about the fiery furnace and all that.
Gotcha. No, this is sort of additional stuff. So what you have from 1 to 22 is the prayer of Azariah. And this is, starts with blessed are you, O Lord, and your ancestors. It kind of goes through some of the history and just praise and power. And I didn't find, quite frankly, 1 through 22 very interesting personally. I just sort of thought, like, okay, this is like a lot of prayers that are found. I mean, it's interesting, but it doesn't really carry the plot much more. It sort of has, and it does have congruence with other prayers. But where it gets interesting, I think, is when you get to verse 23, and that gets to the song of the three Jews. It says, then verse 23 of prayer of Azariah, now that the king's servants who threw them in kept stoking the furnace with naphtha, pitch, tow, and brushwood, and the flames poured above the furnace 49 cubits and spread out and burnt those Chalcedons who were caught near the furnace. So it gives you more detail about what they were stoking it with and the spread of the flame. But the angel of the Lord came down into the furnace to be with Azariah and his companions, and drove the fiery flame out of the furnace, and made the inside of the furnace as though, and I did like this, as though a moist wind were whistling through it. The fire did not touch them at all and caused them no pain or distress. Then with the three in one voice, they praised and glorified God, blessed God in the furnace. And then it goes into the prayer of the God of basically all of creation. It kind of has this standard Hebrew exaltation of sort of a rhythm. Blessed, which starts on I guess it would start on 35. It sort of picks up. Bless the Lord, all you works of the Lord. Sing praises to him. Highly exalt him forever. Bless the Lord, you heavens. Sing praises to him. Highly exalt forever. Bless you, angels of the Lord. Sing praises highly. So it's all, it really does have a song type cadence to it with the refrain. And it goes and basically there goes through the angels of the Lord. If I can do this, let me see if I can focus my bifocal on it. All you waters above the heavens, all you powers of the Lord, sun and moon, stars in heaven, rain and dew, winds, fire and heat, winter cold and summer heat, dews and falling snow, days and nights, lights and darkness, ice and cold, frost and snows, lightning and clouds. All of these things fall into the same cadence of bless the Lord, and lightning and clouds, sing praises to him and exalt. Let the earth bless the Lord. Let's sing praises to him. And it goes on in this way, almost to the very end. So this is all up to verse what eventually is 27 in its own right, but through 68, through 26. Where is that? And then 23 through 20. I'm reading that wrong. 23 through 27 is. Where is it? 23 through 27 is the part that I read you. And then it goes into the song of the song of the three Jews. And it ends with, bless the Lord, Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael, sing praises to him and the highly exalt him forever, for he rescued us from Hades. And again, I'm glad that it translates it Hades and rather than hell, but this is the idea, is that's metaphorical, the idea of just that burning, and saved us from the power of death, delivered us from the midst of the burning fiery furnace. In the midst of the fire, he's delivered us. Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good, for his mercy endures forever. All who worship the Lord and bless the God of gods, sing praise to him and give thanks to him, for his mercy endures forever.
That's this one. I don't know. I got more from this one because that to me is like a psalm of praise that could be used, that should be used. It's a beautiful.
Yeah, maybe we should include that.
Very lyrical kind of song of praise.
And again, that's what none of it's bad. And that, in particular, some of it's a little. I told you earlier on, there were some contradictions when we had Sirach and Baruch. There were things that were incongruent with the story of Israel. Did the earth come up, or was it the water going up in the Moses Exodus? Well, there's nothing really offensive here. The only reason they reject it is because we only have these in Greek. And if they had found one of these in a Hebrew or Semitic text that predated that sort of first century, they probably would have included it. But they didn't, because it was only. What's that? That
opening section, I was kind of curious about that because.
Which one? Of the whole.
First 22 verses. This character Azariah, whichever one of those three men he was, almost seems to be. It's almost like a prayer of confession. Like we kind of brought this on ourselves by our. This is God's punishment for our disobedience.
You've executed true judgment on all you have brought upon us, upon Jerusalem, the whole city of our ancestors. You mean the actual beginning of the whole section?
Right. The beginning of this whole book, this whole prayer is that they kind of deserve this punishment.
It is definitely a communal confession, and it and which again is not necessarily unthinkable.
That is the book of Daniel, really, that they were thinking that they deserved that punishment. That's only here, right?
Yeah, no, it does give some context to the three and the data of the three Daniel's friends. And I read somewhere, I think, that they compared Shadrach, Abednego was considered Azariah.
Oh.
I don't know if that's true, but again, the additions, that's a first century interpretation of that. I think it more even just sort of establishes just that they were confessing, they were humble, they were, again, think of it in terms of what does this communicate to early Jews, first century Jews? What is this telling you about what it means to be a man of God? Well, it tells you that there's even in the face of adversity, the first thing we do is confess our own, and I think actually, and I didn't pick that up, Glenn. I'm glad you brought that up because, it immediately makes me think, you all know that I was fired from that big church in Seattle, and it took me some time to get to a place where I could sort of really, address and forgive and find God in that whole narrative. But part of that came with my own confession and my own acknowledgement of my own failures in that story. And so, in many ways, this, what I would say is that this probably was the version that those first century Jews were reading. Mm-hmm. Just because we found earlier versions doesn't mean that this wasn't the popular version. And honestly, if you gave me the two versions and one had all this extra stuff, I'd probably like this version better. So to be honest, I wish they would have put it in the version of Daniel and just put the whole thing in italics or something, so you can get that sense of flow. Because I kind of feel a little like I was cheated. So, any other thoughts or comments around the prayer of Azariah? Okay, so then the story then ends with all give thanks to the God, for he is good, for his mercy endures forever. All who worship the Lord and bless the God of gods. And again, I would just point out, anytime the whole Old Testament really acknowledges other gods. And this has been really interesting for me in terms of, as God of small case G gods. Even in the Ten Commandments, thou shalt not worship any other gods before me. The presence of the idea of another deity or other deities is not something that Yahweh, our God, dismisses. It's something that he incorporates into the and addresses and deals with in the cosmology of ancient Near East Jews. That these were gods. And I started thinking about the fact that you had all of the celestial stuff that we studied this past summer, and the idea that there are these celestial beings may have really brought me to a place where I think there were evil forces there. I think there were evil powers and principalities that existed in these statues. They weren't benign. It really wasn't just purely a statue. There could have been, some, not a deity, but some celestial being, some actual lived being that was functioning in an expression or a fault. And so it's not necessarily not a God. It's not the existence or the obliteration of the idea of another God, but it's the acknowledgement that they're false gods. They're not the one true God. They're smaller representations of celestial beings. But it ends with sing to him and give thanks to him, for his mercies endure forever. And so you have all of this whole story. You have the prayer of Azariah, the prayer of the three Jews, and then it picks up. Then King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished and rose up quickly. So what you have from a movie perspective is them throwing him in the fire, and then the camera goes down into the fiery furnace, and you have the prayers, and you have the dialogue, and you have this, and then in prayer, and then the camera goes back up to the setting of the court or wherever the king was. Then the king Nebuchadnezzar was astonished and rose up. There's almost a chance in some ways for the reader to have the perspective of the men, the Daniel's friends in the furnace. So we as readers are brought, or hearers are brought into the story of the dialogue or the narrative or the thinking of these three characters that are in the fiery furnace now with this fourth. And then we're brought back up to the reality of the situation around. Then the king Nebuchadnezzar was astonished and rose up quickly. And he said to his counselors, "Were not three men that were bound and thrown into the fire?" And the king answered, "O true, O king," he replied, "but I see four men unbound walking in the middle of the fire, and they are not hurt. The fourth is the appearance of a god. This is the angel." And for whatever that means in terms of the visual difference between one, I think it's interesting because one, it appears is somewhat in the form of humans. Four men, so four, not necessarily men in the sense of men who they are, just four humans, probably more would be more accurate. But one had something different about them. So you have the form of human, but something notably different that the king was able to recognize. And then the story goes on. Okay, so let's go to Bel the dragon.
Is Bel a Greek version of the name Baal, B-A-A-L?
To be honest with you, I did not come across that in my reading, but it could have been. I would neither deny or confirm that. So now we'll go to the end of Daniel. For those who are following with Daniel itself, you have these four crazy visions. I'll just read the last few verses in chapter 12 of Daniel. He said, "Go away, Daniel, for the words," reverse reading in verse 12:9. Go your way, Daniel, for the words are to return secret and sealed until the time of the end. Then he shall be purified, cleansed, and refined, for the wicked shall continue to act wickedly. None of the wicked shall understand, but those who are wise shall understand. Hey, that sounds a lot like the wisdom of that sermon a few weeks ago about the wisdom and the foolishness of God. None of the wicked shall understand, but those who are wise shall understand. For the time that the regular burnt offering is taken away, and the abomination that desolate is set up, there should be 1,290 days. Happy are those who persevere and attain the 1,335 days. But you go your way and rest, and you shall rise for your reward at the end days. So now we got to skip ahead, and this is where Bel and the dragon pick up. And then you come into Bel and the Dragon, and then the story would pick up when King Astyages was laid to rest with his ancestors. Sirius the Persian succeeded him to his kingdom. Daniel was a companion of the king. He was most honored of all of his friends. Now the Babylonians had an idol called Bel. Let me just see real quick if I have any reader's notes about. Yeah, I don't know. I'd have to look that up. Sorry, that's a good question though. And every day they provided for it 12 bushels of choice flour and 40 sheep and 6 measures of wine. And the king revered it, and every day went to worship. But Daniel worshipped his own God. Sounds familiar. We've already had this story that was back in chapter 6 of Daniel. Why do you not worship with your hands the living God who created the heavens and earth and has dominion over all creatures? And the king said, do you not think Bel is a living God? Do you not see how much he eats and drinks every day? And Daniel laughed and said, do not be deceived, O king, for this thing is only clay inside, a bronze outside, and it never ate or drank anything. Which I actually thought was kind of interesting. It's kind of like it's a bronze plated God. I just assumed that all those things were like the calf. They were all 100% precious mineral. No, this is even one step worse. He's like, your God's not even rich enough to have it's like a Easter bunny, chocolate bunny, a hollow one that has
feet of clay.
Feet of clay, yeah. No, and so yeah, it's just. And then King was angry and called the priests of Bel and said to them, if you tell me if you do not tell me who is eating these provisions, you shall all die. But if you prove that Bel is eating them, Daniel shall die, because he has spoken blasphemy against Bel. And Daniel said to the king, let it be done as you said. So gauntlet thrown down, challenge extended. Here we go. And I again, as a teenager, as a junior, I would have loved that. I was like, all right, I always loved that challenge, that Elijah in the fire and calling down the flames. It's kind of like, the bully is taken care of. And as the story goes, what we have is in Daniel, or this Bel and the Dragon is divided actually into 3 parts as well. 1 through 22 goes all the way up in 21 and 22. Then the king was enraged and he arrested the. I don't want to go too far. So basically, what happens is they put the food in. Daniel says, "Seal it up." And then they discover early in the morning, the king rose and came with Daniel and said, the king, are the seals unbroken, Daniel? And he answered, they are unbroken, O king. And as soon as the panels were open, or the doors were open, the king looked at the table and shouted in a loud voice, you are great, O Bel. In you there is no deceit at all. But Daniel laughed and restrained from the king from going in. He said, look at the flow. I forgot to say. So he spread ash around, basically, so to catch their footprints. And you think they would have figured out how to like respread it or something, but they were very smart. But Daniel laughed. I like how he laughs at the king. It's funny. And to restrain the king from going in, he said, look at the floor. He said, notice whose footprints these are. The king said, I see footprints of men and women and children. I don't know how he distinguished between men and women, quite frankly. Like, men don't always have big feet and women don't always have small feet. And then again, how do you distinguish between the kids? Maybe there was lots of different footprints. And the king was enraged, and he arrested the priests and their wives, and they showed him their secret doors through which they went through to enter and consume what was on the table. Therefore, the king put them to death and gave Bel over to Daniel, who destroyed it in its temple. So you have the main part of the story, the uncovering of the plot and the deception that the priests were involved in. That all is up to 122. And then you have, which I think is interesting, you have 23 through 27. And it says, now in that place there was a great dragon which the Babylonians revered. The king said to Daniel, you cannot deny that this is the living God, so worship him. And Daniel said, I worship the Lord God, who is the living God. But give me permission, O king, and I will kill the dragon without a sword or club. And the king said, I give you permission. Then Daniel took pitch, fat, and hair and boiled them together and made cakes, for which he fed to the dragon, and the dragon ate them and burst open. So there's part of me that's like, this is the part where it gets confusing and weird, but it's kind of nice, because it's funny. And the Daniel said, see what you've been worshiping. And when the Babylonians heard, they were indignant and conspired against the king, saying, the king has become a Jew and destroyed Bel. But like, if the dragon wasn't eating the food and it was the priests, so I don't really know. I don't really have I couldn't find a rational explanation as to what actually happened, whether God animated this statue and it ate this mixture of. But again, these are things that could have been pieced together as well. And so that's sort of the second part. Daniel blows them up with some concoction, basically poisons them. And I don't know, it was like vinegar and baking soda, and it blew up. It was too much. It was like Mentos and Diet Coke. And it had a big explosion. And then the last section, 28 through 42, is the second round of the lion's den. And if you go to where is it? It starts with 28. And when the Babylonians heard about this, they were upset, and they said, hand us over, or we're going to the king. They said, hand Daniel over to us, or else we will kill you in your house. When the king saw they were pressing him and under compulsion, so he handed Daniel over to them. They threw Daniel, 31, they threw Daniel in the lion's den. He was there for 6 days, as opposed to just one in the original. In chapter 6, there were 7 lions in the den, and every day they'd been given 2 human bodies and 2 sheep. But now they were giving nothing, so they would devour Daniel. And this is where the prophet Habakkuk was in Judea, and he made a stew and in broken bowls and bread. And he came and he becomes the one who ultimately feeds Daniel. And as the story goes, Daniel was saved, the lions didn't eat him. And the king in the end says to those who accuses of Daniel of what they did, the king on the 7th day, on the verse 40, the king came down to mourn for Daniel, and he came to the den and looked in, and there sat Daniel. The king shouted with a loud voice, "You are great, O Lord, the God of Daniel, and there is no other besides you." He pulled Daniel out and threw into the den those who had attempted his destruction, and they were instantly eaten before his eyes. Barbaric in many ways. Again, this was commonplace. This wouldn't have been, for those hearing at the time, this is the time of Roman Colosseums where they were throwing things into the, this was a time where our understanding of human civilization was not quite the same. That was interesting. There was a historic account of the destruction of the statue of Bel the dragon, but it was during the reign of King Xerxes the First, sometime between 486 and 465, and it's thought historically that the king actually was the one who destroyed it. But the interesting things about there are 2 versions: the Old Greek, which introduces that comes in, and this isn't the version that we have, but so this is the version that the Greek would have had that we don't have in ours. But it introduces us from the prophet Habakkuk about Daniel. In other words, they address it as from the perspective of Habakkuk as one ministering to Daniel, and then the Theodosian version, which is we have, introduces during the reign of Cyrus Medina, 585 to 550, and this would have thought to have been the grandfather of Cyrus, the one who freed the Jews and sent them back in the establishment. What's that?
So it's not the same Cyrus.
What's that? It's not the same Cyrus. No, that's the Cyrus. This is the, I don't know, I wrote down grandfather, but that's not what it was. It was grandfather. It would have been the grandfather of the Cyrus that we understood. So establishing just that, it was during the time of exile or something to that effect. But both versions have Habakkuk bringing food to Daniel in the lion's den. It's just one introduces from the idea of the dating, which is what we use, versus the idea from the perspective of the prophet Habakkuk. All three sections that we have here, which could have been also compiled, the main thrust of them are that they condemn idolatry. In the first section, Daniel exposes the fraud in the Babylonian priests and sort of makes fun of them, and that's that whole laughing mockery. 23 through 27, that blowing up of Bel, however you want to look at that mythological, it was sort of like the destruction of Bel. And then the final round of the lines, then just adding a little more detail to that. And all of them, they're saying like, these gods are false. Everything you think you're doing is false. And so it's this sort of divine reversal. It's interesting that the food theme is throughout the whole thing. In the first section, you have the false, you have the priest eating the food. And then in the second section, I guess it mentions the withholding of the food from the lions to make Daniel more tasty, and then finally the provisions for Daniel provided by Habakkuk. And all of these point for the reader to the testimony that King Cyrus then turned to God, seeing the way through the use of food and the mockery of idolatry that God is praised and exalted. I think that's all I got.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, Danny, that was quick. You were like, I'm out.
Do you think this Cyrus would have had some kind of effect on his grandson Cyrus?
What do you mean?
Having some sympathy for the Jews?
I think in general, yeah. I mean, I think that the Cyrus that freed the Jews was really listening to the advisors of people saying, "Hey, there are too many nations here. You don't want to make them all mad. Let's create allies. Let's strategically have allies in nations so we don't have to try to, they as population has grown steadily. I mean, we've seen more in the last century than they did for thousands of years. But as populations grew, there's the extent of how do you maintain this giant swath of territory? You don't have that many Persians to do so. Well, then you put dignitaries there, you put military there. But if you're allowing people to exist in their own cultural context, in their own place, and have their own rituals, and you just have some occupation, then they become allies rather than then there's no need to revolt, so to speak. So, and that's it. Exciting. I don't know if it's exciting, but I thought they were interesting. But if you haven't, and honestly, you can find them on Wikipedia pretty easy. If you're interested to go back, it would take you all about a half an hour probably to read all of them and put them into context. And you probably can actually find a version of Daniel that has them all in sequence as well. So, any final thoughts or questions?
So the Maccabees is longer.
The Maccabees will be the longest actual text that we're looking at.
Yeah.
Between the four. And in my Bible, they're actually split 1 and 2, and there's a large break, and then there's 3 and 4. I haven't really looked at much at what the content of it is, so I can't really speak to that other than the fact that they were written around the time of the Maccabean revolt and represent Jewish thought and idealism. And
it's like, well, that Esdras, that's not included.
We'll look at that the final week, along with Psalm 151 and a prayer of someone, I don't remember who.
So this is like 40 pages.
Yeah. And we'll just do an overview of all 4. I'll sort of do an overview of what was going on historically, and then how the 4 chapters contribute to Jewish identity.
Where's the 4? I see 1 Maccabees and 2 Maccabees.
Are they not in your Bible?
I have 1 and 2.
I'm just going. Mine goes after Bel and the Dragon and the additions to Daniel. It goes 1 and 2 Maccabees, 1 Ezra, the prayer of Manasseh, Psalm 151, Maccabees 3, Ezra 2, and Maccabees 4. So I'm just going to take them out of order and extract all of the Maccabees, look at all of those, and then we'll go back and we'll do 1 and 2 in the prayer of Manasseh and Psalm 151.
Okay.
Final week. It'll be a great Ash Wednesday celebration of the end of this series. So the other thing, if there's no questions, I'm going to stop this so this isn't the end.